In 2024, director Denis Villeneuve and star Timothée Chalamet gave the world a bombastic science fiction epic that challenged the rules of the game.
In 2024, we visit the totally sandy dunes of Ireland to try a 30-year whiskey.
The film is Dune Part 2.
The whiskey is Bushmills 30-year single malt.
And we'll review them both. This is the Film and Whiskey Podcast.
Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And Brad, it is our last official episode of 2024. We are ending the year on a pretty damn high note here, too, because we're actually talking about a movie from 2024.
It's absolutely wild. And I feel like it's a movie that has the most recognizable, like, since Inception's pwah. Mm-hmm. I feel like the ha ha is like the most recognizable little sound piece from a movie in a decade.
Yeah, it's amazing, though, how, you know, we've talked about this with any movie set in Iraq or Afghanistan. Like, you get that, like, kind of questionable, like, minaret call. And now here we are on a desert planet thousands of light years away, and we're still getting that exact same, like, whoever's paying that person to keep them employed with that little trill of a voice, they are making bank off of sandy movies.
Here's the thing, though, man. It doesn't matter when you make it freaking awesome.
And I would say Dune Part 2 is, in fact, freaking awesome. Brad, I literally just finished watching this movie about 20 minutes before we hopped on tonight. It's my third time having seen the film. And I realized that I don't think we've actually covered Dune Part 1 on this podcast before, so it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm sure we'll have to lay some groundwork for both the Dune books and the Dune movies, and in order to do that, we're going to need some help. So we've enlisted the help of a good friend of ours, making, I believe, his third appearance already on the podcast. Second, we're going to say third. It sounds better. He's making numbers at me. It's our friend David Thomas Tao. David, how are you today, man?
I'm excellent. And you know what? The fun fact, you watched Dune Part 2, right before this. Right after this, I'm going to watch the new episode of Dune Prophecy,
which
has become my Sunday night tradition. So the timing of this couldn't be better from a nerd perspective.
It's amazing how quickly the Star Wars Disney acquisition pipeline has gone for the Dune IP. Warner Brothers was like, you know what? We own this now. We're going to pump out 2 movies and then immediately get a TV show going as well. I have not yet watched Dune Prophecy. I'm sure a lot of people are catching up on it here over the holidays. What's your opinion on the show so far? Because you're the only authoritative voice here on it.
I'm really enjoying it, and I think I'm liking it more than others. And I think the criticism, my quick thing is, I think a lot of the criticism is that it feels different than Dune, and that things don't feel as coalesced or as tight. The thing I'll say about Dune Prophecy, it's set 10,000 years before Dune, and it gives background on how a lot of the social structures and groups that are major players in the Dune movies and books actually came into being. So the criticism I'm hearing from a lot of folks is that it feels like Dune, but not as like tight, not as congealed. That's kind of the point, right? It's like, let's go 10,000 years in the past and see how all these social structures and norms and heuristics originated. And like, it shouldn't feel as tight, right? It should feel a little different, but directionally similar. And that's what it feels like. I'm really enjoying it, actually. And I'm enjoying it, I think, more than most, because I enjoy the large timelines on which the Dune IP operates.
Well, and that's the beauty of a television series, right? Is that it doesn't have to be as tight. Like Denis talks about how for him, the editing room is where he becomes most brutal with a movie, because he it's like he is like cutting down his children when he throws them on the floor. And a TV show, you don't quite have to do that as much. It's like, yeah, we can leave it a little bit because we got 2 seasons, 3 seasons to work on this.
Well, and Denis Villeneuve, famous for his brutality in the editing room. That's how you get down to a tight 2 hours and 47 minutes,
But that said, we'll talk about this on the podcast, I'm sure. One of my favorite actors currently working in Hollywood was entirely cut from the movie.
Yes.
Because the director had to be brutal in the editing room because the story is so it's true. It's epic. It's epic in nature. It is the definition of an epic.
You're talking, of course, about the extended cameo by Jerry Seinfeld, which
I am talking about.
Really controversial.
What's the deal with the spice? Is it a drug? Is it a seasoning? I can't do a Jerry Seinfeld impression. Clearly,
that was great.
That was fantastic.
What's the deal with Space Guild food? Anyway, that's a real.
Brad, a couple weeks ago, we did District 9 on the podcast and talked and lamented a bit at that time about how we don't really do a lot of hard sci-fi on this podcast. And we broke down soft sci-fi versus hard sci-fi. This is probably the most intricate sci-fi world building and lore we've ever had from it is the hardest of all hard sci-fis. Yes.
Here's turgid sci-fi. I'm sorry. As Bushmills for actually agreeing to this. I'm so sorry.
This whole part is only Patreon because we need to get into the turgid versus flaccid sci-fi spectrum here. Go ahead, Brad.
Here's the thing with Dune, I would say part 1 and part 2. I think that the reason it is so successful is because Denis wraps all of the hard sci-fi elements in this mystical cinematography and sound design, and it's just kind of flowing, and it almost feels like a slower version of a Terrence Malick film at times, where it's just this almost like a drug-induced haze of a film that is masking like very, very deep sci-fi roots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, well, I think maybe the best place to start is to get into our first segment of the day, which we call Brad Explains.
Brad's gonna give us the movie plot with only 60 seconds ticking on the clock. So let's go ahead and hear your take with this little segment that we call Brad Explains.
Brad Explains is the part of the show where Brad breaks down the plot of the film that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, this was not your first time seeing Dune 2. I did convince you to go to the movie theater and see this film. One of my proudest moments, if I'm being honest.
After failing to get me to see Oppenheimer in theaters.
or Dune Part 1. I was really striking out on huge scale movies. It would have been funny if you'd been like, you know what? I think I'm going to go see Barbie in IMAX. I think that's the movie that's going to get me there. But no, you saw Dune Part 2. So it's not your first time. However, I think there's a short way to explain this movie, and there's a very detailed way to explain this movie. So I'm interested to see what you can cram into 60 seconds here. Folks, if you've not seen Dune Part 2, I'd encourage you to press pause, go watch this movie, and then come back and join us for the rest of the episode, because Brad is going to spoil the hell out of it. So, Brad, the movie has not hit the Oscars yet. People are going to be catching up with this movie. Hopefully they'll return to this spoiler-filled conversation afterwards. 1 minute on the clock, and go.
Dune Part 2 is a film that follows Paul Atreides and his mother as they are taken in by the Fremen after their entire house was slaughtered by the Harkonnens in the previous film. Paul learns how to be a Fremen warrior, while the Fremen begin to slowly believe that he is the prophesied savior of their people that will bring prosperity back to the planet. He falls in love with a Fremen woman named Chandri. Is that it? Chani. Yes, Chani. And eventually follows his mother to the deep south, where there is a large portion of fanatical Fremen, where he knows that he will be made a prophet, which he doesn't want, but he goes anyways, drinks worm piss, and man, he has all the visions. And he unites the Fremen under one banner, takes the Emperor of the Galaxy hostage, kills his champion, and decides to wed his daughter so that he can rule a galactic empire.
Boom. Dune Part 2. Not bad. Not bad at all, Brad.
Thanks, man.
I am going to throw over to our friend David. He's been patiently waiting, chomping at the bit over here. We sent our list of movies out to you and said, take your pick of the litter here. And you said, let's do Dune Part 2. So I'll let you set the stage for our conversation because I want to know what was the immediate attraction to Dune Part 2. Why this movie as opposed to any other?
I think it's because Dune Part 2 exists at the center of that rare Venn diagram, or the small center of the Venn diagram of, based on existing IP I really truly love, and also fantastic execution. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that if you don't know anything about the Dune universe and you see Dune and then Dune Part 2, Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, I think you're getting a great 2-part cinematic experience. And I think it's a fantastic introduction to a very complex world that Frank Herbert built, and that really set the standard for sci-fi, fantasy. I mean, you name it. It's impossible to understate the cultural influence, the literary influence, and the genre influence of the Dune universe. You combine that with the fact that this is just a really well done movie. Mm-hmm. It's hard to do sequel. This isn't really a sequel. It's truly a part 2, right? These are 2 movies. The first book, the book Dune, is split across 2 movies. But it's really hard to do a second movie well. It's hard to do any movie well. And Dune 2, I think, nails it. It's a sort of movie where I go into the theater. I love the IP. I've read the book multiple times. I've read the sequels. I've immersed myself in this. And I've been on fan forums. And I sit down and I'm nervous. I'm nervous about the execution. And I'm nervous about what is not going to make it into the film, what has to be cut. But I didn't think throughout the entirety of the film, it wasn't until well after the film when I was thinking about, wait a minute, I think this character might have been cut, which is not a problem. But like during the film, I was not distracted by what didn't make it in. I was immersed in the universe, and I think it's fantastic execution. And I think it's rightly an Oscar contender, which is tough for sci-fi films. We don't see that happen. But this is a cinematic achievement, and I am just so happy that this IP that I really grew up with and was, especially in high school, so obsessed with, is now in a mainstream form that does it justice, at least as well as we can, right? I don't think anything replicates the universe and the world building you can do in your head when you're reading the book, right? But as far as a visual and audio representation on a big screen, I thought it was great. And, from casting all the way through execution to scoring, lovely. So that's why it was like a no-brainer. I was like, this is the one, right? Mm-hmm. This is it.
I was going to say, I believe Arrival would have been the last like serious sci-fi contender. And I know it didn't have a huge shot at winning Best Picture, but it was nominated at the very least.
Well, yeah, and Dune Part 1 was nominated as well. And I think kind of controversially, it got a lot of what is called below the line nominations. So all of your crafts, cinematography, costume design, set design. Denis Villeneuve not nominated for Best Director for Dune Part 1, which was a huge controversy because if all of these things that add up to a cohesive vision do not point to a really, really smart and astute director behind the camera, I don't know what does. And just when you're talking about scale and scope of a film, I don't really know that anyone is doing it the way that Villeneuve is doing it right now. Like the only real comparison is Nolan, but a Nolan film feels very different to a Villeneuve movie. And Brad, especially having just done Oppenheimer a couple months ago, Oppenheimer's a movie, and I really want to tread lightly because I gave it a 10 out of 10. It's a great movie. It's a movie that's made so much in the edit. Like there's so much of that is, relying upon callbacks to different time periods and jumping across timelines and kind of creating this overwhelming experience through the edit. Whereas I think Villeneuve is really good at just building massive sets and putting really good at geography, making you feel the scale of someone that's this big against a sandworm that's enormous. And I don't know that anyone has that kind of old school understanding of scale the way that Villeneuve does right now.
I just want to interject, and this is a yes, this is a yes, and I don't think since the original Star Wars series, when we saw the Death Star, and we had to get a sense of how big that was, has anyone done physical scale this well in a major sci-fi film release?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, and there are multiple aspects of that. It could be the size of the sandworms. It could be the size of the Spacing Guild craft, and you see how big these, what's like 20-kilometer long spacecraft are relative to like the actual ships, the transport ships transporting people. Like the scale of everything is so to the Emperor's arrival ship, right? Which we see here. I think a challenge here is this movie has to have sci-fi elements, but it's also imperial. It has to have pomp and circumstance, right? And so you look at this and you're like, "Oh, I'm seeing a lot that reminds me of Star Wars." But then you look at the original Star Wars series, and I'm sure there have been books written about this. Star Wars, it's arguable, like, could Star Wars exist if it weren't for the Dune books? Right? The answer is maybe not.
Yeah.
Right? Because Dune was first. They were the first to do this operatic, epic scale sci-fi world building.
Yeah, and it's well documented that Lucas was a huge fan of the books. I think that another good comparison point, and one that I'd really like to pick Brad's brain on a little bit, is this, both literarily and cinematically, as a comparison point to The Lord of the Rings. I think this is probably the most intricate, like I've already said the phrase intricate world building, but especially from a sci-fi or fantasy film spread across multiple movies done on this scale. It's the first time this has really happened since Lord of the Rings. Like, you could argue Harry Potter a little bit, but I just think that we're not talking about quite the global scale that, Lord of the Rings or Dune is operating on. And I think that there's a lot to dive in on here. And I've got some great nuggets from my research about like what Tolkien thought of the Dune books and everything else. But Brad, as a fan of Lord of the Rings, as a super fan of Lord of the Rings, the Dune story, does it grip you in the same way as a Lord of the Rings does?
I don't think it does. Oh man, it's such a hard comparison, Bob. Tolkien was way less interested in the internal lives of his characters. Like, at the end of the day, Tolkien was way more fascinated by the external forces of the world around it, of like what's going on in Middle-earth and these larger-than-life characters who are like utilizing their will to shape the world in a way that they see fit. And you see Sauron do that in negative ways, and you see Gandalf and Aragorn do that in powerful ways for good.
Mm-hmm.
And, the movies, I will say, show way more of the struggle internally for Frodo and Sam and Aragorn and all of these characters. Faramir, right? Like, one of the most famous differences from the books to the movies is that Faramir doesn't even come close to being tempted by the ring in the books. And I actually think that that's a good comparison to bring up, because Tolkien believed in good people being good,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not necessarily tempted by the darkness. And like Frank Herbert essentially was like, no, that's not true. Everybody is tempted by the darkness. Everybody is tempted by power. What will we do to gain control of it? Now, I will say, David, you're more the expert on Dune here. I have not read those books, but from the comparisons I've seen of Lord of the Rings to Dune, as you were alluding to, Bob, about your research, Tolkien hated Dune.
Not a fan of the books, no.
He did not like those books. And I think it comes down to that they just had a different underlying foundational view on humanity and the world and all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, they're written to two entirely different historical contexts, too, even though they're only, 20 years apart at the most. But Tolkien is writing immediately post-war, when he and Lewis are trying to extrapolate their own beliefs and reframe this fight that they have seen on a continental and global scale of good versus evil, and to reaffirm what they believe to be the good, and the good that is inside of everybody and which is worth fighting for. And it does not, obviously, it is not hindered at all by the fact that Tolkien and Lewis are both avowed Christians. And so there are tons of Christian themes in the Lord of the Rings books. Herbert, on the other hand, is writing 15, 20 years later, and he's a little bit disillusioned with what America is doing at the dawn of the military-industrial complex. He doesn't like what we're doing to kind of position ourselves to get oil. He looks at new drugs like LSD, and he's writing... I mean, he's kind of a contemporary of authors like Ken Kesey, who's writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest about LSD at this time as well. It's a much more cynical, not quite nihilistic, but just really emotionally cold tale. And you can see why Tolkien wouldn't like it. And I guess I'm wondering how that affects your enjoyment of this adaptation, Brad and David. Because I think that it perfectly captures the cold, calculating kind of castle intrigue politics that Herbert is getting at in a way that appeals to fans of shows like Game of Thrones. Like it's right in line with shows like that.
I was just going to say that, like, this so clearly points towards a Game of Thrones like belief about the world than it does a C.S. Lewis Tolkien-esque view of the world. And I think it's fascinating because I actually think that Dune Part 2, at the very least, leans less into the cynicism and more into a belief mindset, like a Tolkien type mindset than maybe Herbert would have intended it to. I mean, obviously Villeneuve is making it, but like for me, especially this time through, I was struck by the end of the film when Paul's mother essentially tells the former like head of her order, the Bene Gesserit witches, I don't know, space witches,
Coven, yeah, sure,
Coven. I mean,
that's what they're referred. That's like how you insult them. You call them like witches or something.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
Sure. I apologize, Bene Gesserit. I'm not trying to offend you. Don't make me do things. But like at the end of it, she tells her like, you chose the wrong side. And she goes, oh, there was never a side. There was only survival, essentially. Mm-hmm. And like, that's the core tension for me of this film, is that Paul continues to say, I don't believe in your BS missionary, like, propaganda, proselytizing. I just want to fight and win this war on my father's behalf. But at the end of the film, and, you know, I don't know where part 3 or Messiah or whatever he's going to call it is going to be, but this film, at the very least, seems to say that believing in something is more powerful than being cynical. Oh, that it's when Paul finally believes in the prophecy, he goes and drinks the water of life, and his eyes are opened, that is the better way than the cynical, oh, we're all just here fighting our own battles type of view.
I'm going to say we have polar opposite readings of the end of this film, Brad, but that's good. It's going to be good for conversation. I might also just be more because I understand like where the arc of the Dune novels goes from here. But I was going to kind of try to set the stage for the rest of the episode by saying the coldness and the sort of emotional arm's lengthness of this overall story, I think continues to be for me the biggest fault in these stories. And it's purposeful. And I think that Villeneuve captures it so well, but there is just something that I can't break through with the Dune films, that I appreciate them and I thoroughly enjoy them. But like, I'm not going to come back to them to the extent that I do something that captures my emotions and my heart the way that like a Lord of the Rings does. And again, that's not the intention of these films, but I think especially when you start comparing them, there is something about they couldn't have made these movies successfully back when David Lynch was trying to do them, or in the 1990s. And I don't think it's a technological thing. I think it's because we were just a fundamentally different people then. And in the wake of 9/11 and all of the wars that we've had since then, this is the sci-fi movie for our times. And I just constantly keep asking myself, what does it say about us that this is what we resonate with now? Do you know what I mean?
Wow. Episode done. Wow.
Yeah.
It's okay. Bob nailed it, folks. Like, that's it.
We did. No, but David, for real, you're the Dune expert here. And I don't want you to be the stand-in for the American people. But
I'm happy to be the stand-in for that. Let's do that. Let me speak for everyone now. Okay, here's my reaction. I actually don't think you all are necessarily coming from polar opposite perspectives here, because I think that I think Brad is speaking to a reaction from watching this film as someone who's not intimately familiar with the IP. And Bob, I think you are someone who knows a bit more about the arc of where this goes, right? And that's one thing that makes the Dune series really great. And when I was reading them, I really enjoy, as a young person, I really enjoyed that because I enjoyed the arc. And for me, it was telegraphed, but somehow still not predictable, right? Like, the entire setup is about a golden path for humanity and about having future sight, right? At the same time, the book series actually is a progression of interesting reveals, even if the characters can literally see into the future, right? Which I think is no small feat literarily, and I think that it's a testament to the fact that Frank Herbert was also quite a great writer and quite a great storyteller, as much as I think some of his contemporaries or the generation right before, for lack of a better term, kind of poo-pooed him a little bit, right? I think that his reveals and the way he set up and the way he actually constructed narratives was really quite interesting. So you all are kind of saying different things, but I think, again, that's the path of the reader, and that's the path of someone who has to go through this story and experience this story, because so much of this is internal. So much of the writing of Dune, and it occurs in the later books as well, but it's especially poignant in the first two, it is internal monologue. It is very different than Tolkien, right? Like, it was brought up earlier, Tolkien didn't super care about the internal thoughts or depth of his characters necessarily. He was kind of writing for the plot more. That might be an oversimplification, but Herbert, so much is happening in the mind, right? So much is happening in Paul's mind, in Lady Jessica's mind, right? In Paul's sister's mind. Like, in Sean, we see this happen with his characters, and later on his children, and the successive progressions of these folks who have the power of future sight. So what I'll say is, I don't think what you're saying are two things that are opposed. I think it's an illustration of how good the progression of this narrative really can be. And the last thing I'll say is survival. I think we can all, where we can link these, is that this is ultimately about pragmatism and survival in many ways. There are a lot of themes in Dune. I'm not trying to distill it down to just those two. But if you look at Dune not as a singular book, but as a 5,000-year arc over the course of Herbert and his son's writings, who kind of finished the narrative in controversial fashion, I will say, it is about survival. How does humanity survive against weapons of its own creation and against its awful instincts? Because we are a self-destructive species, right? Is there a way for us to survive as our power grows and as the power of our creation grows? And for me, that's what I take away ultimately from Dune. There are a lot of other themes. So if we can all agree that this is a story of survival, and the question, does humanity actually make it long term? I think there's a lot of common ground and different evolutions of that understanding.
Yeah, and the way you're talking about it makes it sound like this might be the ultimate Cold War novel.
Yeah.
Or series, I should say.
I think it's especially poignant, too, because right now everything, you can't turn on the news or read anything without hearing about AI. Herbert's one of his strokes of genius was to say, okay, we're going to set up a universe in which that's banned, right? We're going to set up a universe. We don't have droids. We don't have thinking machines. In fact, it's the whole point of the plot. It's outlined in the Orange Bible, which is like the tome for the Dune universe for the people in it. thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of the human mind, right? And Herbert was literally generations ahead of so many authors in being like, well, that's a consideration. In the earliest phases of the computer age, he was already thinking about the ramifications of that, right? This is pre-Matrix. Do you get the Matrix without Dune? No. No hate to the Wachowskis.
Dude, the scene when Paul is in the chamber with millions of Fremen, like, all I could see was like, oh, this is a better version of, is it Matrix 2, I think, that has that?
And similarly, what Dune Prophecy, which I'm watching right now, gives more of the backstory. Dune Prophecy set like 120 years after the war with the thinking machines. And by the way, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but the relevance of the danger of thinking machines becomes a central plot point, a more central plot point in subsequent Dune novels. So the further you go into the sequels, the more you understand why Herbert kind of set that up.
I think that's one of the brilliances of this, at least the visual adaptations, and what Herbert did was by de-technologizing some of it, like, he just made for a really cool universe where people stab each other with swords instead of just shoot each other with bullets. Like, somehow he's created this world where I readily believe that they can be shooting down helicopters with, like, RPGs and also need to fight in hand-to-hand combat. Mm-hmm. Like, that's so cool.
He does kind of do this day. I think it's, I should know this off the top of my head. I think it's called the Holtzman effect, which is where, like, oh, that's the thing that explains, we figured out levitation, we figured out, like, space-time folding, and we figured out invisible shields, and it's all due to this one thing that we haven't discovered yet, right? And, like, that explains all the technology that we can't comprehend right now. It's just, like, all of it is kind of just figured out by this thing that he never goes into detail on, which you kind of have to do, right? At a certain point, you kind of have to be like, here's a plot device, done.
Guys, before we get to break, I want to pull us out of our super nerdy sci-fi conversation here. And let's talk about the cinematic merits of the film. We've talked about Villeneuve a little bit. I think we should just kind of dive into the cast. Because where I really want to take the back half of the episode is exploring the moral and ethical quandaries that are presented, especially by Paul. I think that's where Herbert's story is the most unique and significantly different from what you get with Tolkien. This idea that he may or may not actually be a messiah, or he may be one that has wholly manufactured his own saviorship, and how dangerous that might be. And I think it's been such a long time since we've had a protagonist who makes potentially very evil decisions at the end of his own hero's arc in this film. But in order to talk about that, we got to talk about the performances. And I say we start right at the top here with Timothée Chalamet. Now, I just went to a press screening of his new film that's just come out called A Complete Unknown, in which he plays Bob Dylan. It's a good film, and he does a good Dylan. And then I watched this movie again, and I am once again reminded that Oscar voters often go for the keys that are being jingled in front of them. This is a better performance than his Bob Dylan, and I'm like legitimately spectacular. The last 40 minutes of the movie are what I'm going to rave about the entire time we're talking, but specifically with Chalamet's performance. From the time he wakes up after drinking the water of life, and he has the scene where he confronts all the Fremen in a theater on the round type environment, and like everything after that is just, it might be the best 40 minutes of acting I've ever seen from Chalamet. It's absolutely Oscar caliber acting, Brad.
The final 40 minutes, yes. The rest of the film, not even close.
What?
I think Chalamet is so weak in so many parts of this movie.
Oh, Brad.
He and Zendaya don't have good chemistry.
Oh, you say these things so dogmatically, as if they are the predominant opinion on these things.
They have like moments together, but there's so many places of awkward dialogue, which I think if there's one thing for me, some of the dialogue in this movie is just straight up bad. And I don't think that Chalamet or Zendaya or anybody else can really redeem it. I think that the two weakest performances of this film are Chalamet and Zendaya.
Oh.
Everybody else in this movie is like top-notch incredible.
Oh, I just, Brad, I really like you so much.
Do it. Finish him.
But I really, the thing is, I really like you're much better than Bob. No, I'm kidding. I love you both.
I mean, accurate.
Obviously.
Yeah.
I'm joking. I fundamentally, I disagree with that. I'm sorry. I don't know if it's my turn to speak, but I disagree with that. I think Chalamet and Zendaya, I think Zendaya's performance is actually extraordinarily nuanced. And I think she has a real challenge of like, we have to show both of these are young people who are coming of age and falling in love for the first time.
Yep.
With universe shattering or shaking consequences. And they have to balance this like youthful finding yourself post-pubescent, who am I, self-discovery with like an order of magnitude of importance more than we folks face. And I think there's a lot of nuance to her performance. I think it's like there's a scene where she has to, and I think this is really brilliant of the creative team to include this, where she like plays a little joke on him, right? And she's like kind of schoolgirl talking with her friends and making fun of him, right? Which is like a nice little moment of levity. It's a little Helga Pataki making fun of Arnold, you know what I mean? And then we see her falling in love, but also we see her becoming disillusioned while everyone else is buying into the savior complex and the messiah complex, right? And that's a lot of weight. And I just want to point out one thing. I love face acting, and it's something that like is or is not a real thing. But there is a scene toward the end of the movie where there's like a premonition of the future after the Holy War and after Paul's forces win the Holy War that kills trillions across the universe. There's a scene of him and Zendaya, this character, and some other characters standing on like this ship while they're overlooking this planet that has been conquered. And like, you want to see good, subtle face acting, look at Zendaya in that scene, right? So I think it's a role that's impossible to do perfectly because she has to convey such an arc, maturing, falling in love, getting disillusioned, kind of falling out of love, but also wrestling with the fact that like, is she more effective in curbing the negative effects of this by staying close to Paul? It's so much to balance. And I was really impressed by her performance. I'm not sure it's the best acting I've seen from Timothée, but I really enjoyed the performance. I thought it was really good. I think it is award nomination consideration worthy.
I think for me, one of the struggles with Timothée is that in moments, like I said, when he's in the round doing his talk to everybody, he's incredible. But the rest of the film, and maybe this was intentional, but every single time he ever raises his voice and tries to be like a leader of some sort, I just found myself going like, dude, you can't pull that off. It's just not there.
Oh.
I don't know if that was just me. I really struggled with him throughout. I do think that if Zendaya, I think that her and Timothée are fine together. I think when the camera's just shoved up into her face, her eyes are incredible. Like she has a real talent to move the viewer with her eyes.
Yeah, I agree with both of you about Zendaya, especially because she was in a movie at the beginning of the year called Challengers, a really great movie by Luca Guadagnino. And to this day, I think it's the best lead female performance I've seen all year. I think she's getting completely left out of awards consideration. But in that movie... Was
that the tennis movie?
Yes.
Fantastic
I just say,
movie. One of my good friends is a sucker for three things, like in films. He loves tennis, he loves Zendaya, and he loves love triangles. And when they came out with that trailer, he texted me and he was like, they made the perfect movie for me.
I was going to say, if his fourth favorite thing was strong homoerotic themes, then that movie is like absolutely up his alley.
He didn't mention those, but who knows?
Well, based on the director, like those are things that are besides tennis, those are all things that are kind of themes in that director's catalog.
Exactly.
So
But I think she's so good in that movie because she's almost playing older than she is in parts of it, but it's also like a 15-year spanning film. And so at the beginning of the film, she's playing like a 17-year-old. And I think her ability to not tip into caricature when she's playing a disillusioned 30-something or a really young ingenue type is really, really stellar. And she does it here as well. To Brad's point, I think our supporting cast, which if you guys don't mind, just indulge me for a second, if I can just read this cast list. So Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya, followed by, in order of credits, Rebecca Ferguson, Josh Brolin, Stellan Skarsgård, Dave Bautista, Charlotte Rampling, Javier Bardem, Austin Butler, Florence Pugh, Christopher Walken, and Léa Seydoux. Maybe the best cast assembled for anything that's not a Marvel IP in the 21st century.
I want to give a quick pour one out. Actually, you know what? I'm going to open my Bushmills while I do this and make it a literal pour one out. Crack the seal on this sample bottle. Pour one out for Tim Blake Nelson, who was in the movie, but whose scenes were cut.
Yep.
And I was personally, I'm not saying it wasn't correct, but I was personally excited when I saw the casting news.
No, David, come out and say it. You know more than Denis.
About whiskey, maybe, you know? But even that's debatable. I don't know. I don't know the man. No. Tim Blake Nelson was originally in the movie. I believe his scenes were filmed. Those were cut along with a few other folks. He just happens to be an actor that I have a particular affinity for. Yeah. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is my favorite film of all time. So that's just what I have to say about that. And the other thing, this is a spoiler alert. Fast forward 30 seconds if you don't want a spoiler. Anya Taylor-Joy in a brief cameo as Paul's sister, which I got to be honest, that wasn't my favorite part of the movie. If I have to point to one weakness in the movie, because like in the book, she's actually born and like is like 3 or 4 years old at the end of the book, but they've just decided to take her this very packed movie. And I think it was actually a good call. I think it was a good call to not have her as like a significant character in this book. And we're going to see her maybe in future movies, but in the book, she's born and has an active role in the plot. In the movie, she does not. It's just kind of like a, future sight scene, and it's more of a cameo.
You said she's 3. I have a 3 that just turned 4-year-old. I'd just like to see her like running around the desert telling grown adults what to do.
Well, that's like, I don't know if you guys have seen the David Lynch film.
Yes.
I have multiple times. And they did that. In the David Lynch film, she's like she's a real creepy 3-year-old. and you know what they accomplished? Making her real creepy.
Yeah. Yeah. Brad, what I would like for you to do is follow your newly 4-year-old around with the microphone so that we can get little transitionary statements of her saying Dune things. Like just getting her to... It's the Kwisatz Haderach. It's Muad'Dib. We'll just throw those in between each of our segments,
All right, I'm ready.
And Brad, this is interesting. Like, again, this is a spoiler. This is a book spoiler. In the book, Paul's sister, 3-year-old Paul's sister, she's the one who kills Baron Harkonnen.
I'm gonna go read those books now.
Like, as a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that was keeping Brad was the assumed lack of child murders in the book series.
But child murders in that it's the children doing the murder. The children getting
important.
Very important.
All right, guys, I think this is a good place to press pause. Otherwise, we're about to go way off the rails.
Child murders. Great place to push pause, Bob.
We'll come back after break. We'll talk about the supporting cast. We'll get into all the ethical quandaries as well. But it's time for us to drink a very expensive whiskey. Brad, what do you say?
No, twist my arm, Bob. All right, everybody. Today, we are drinking Bushmills 30. Now this, as one might guess, is a 30-year-old Irish whiskey that Bushmills has recently released, I believe. Bob, we are getting into some rarefied air here.
We certainly are. And just a peek behind the curtain. We told David what we had planned to drink for this episode. I don't think he had it on hand. And knowing that the guy has a lot of whiskey on hand, I just sent him a list of all the whiskeys we'd planned to drink in the next 8 weeks or so. And he said, oh, Bushmills 30 sounds good. Let me contact my Bushmills guy. And I don't know what magic he worked, what Bene Gesserit schemes he's been up to in the background, but he was able to secure his own sample of Bushmills 30 single malt. Now, there is also a Bushmills 29 year that we'll be trying next week, and that is called Bushmills 29 year rare cask. So there's a difference between just the rare cask and the single malt. We're drinking that 30-year-old variety here today, Brad. This was aged in bourbon barrels and sherry butts for 14 years, taken out of those barrels and then finished again in first fill PX sherry casks for an additional 16 years. And I have to say that of all the Irish whiskeys we have ever tried on this podcast, this is by far the darkest in color, Brad.
Oh, far and away the darkest in color. And Bob, I was actually thinking with so many things like finished in PX casks, I want to, like, I don't know how rare it is. I want to actually get my hands on some Pedro Jimenez sherry sometime and try it, because I feel like with so many things finished in it, I need to know, what is the OG juice actually like?
Well, I'm sure David's got a PX guy that he can hook us up with.
I was just saying, we can make that happen. I'm not coughing because of this. I'm coughing because I have the winter allergies. I do want to give a quick shout out. I reached out to there's a group called Articulate, which does a lot of the PR for Bushmills in the U.S. And I reached out to my contact there, knowing they rep Bushmills, and they were super excited about this. And they were just like, how can we help? And they just messengered this sample of Bushmills 30. The best thing was they asked, like, wait, Bushmills 30, like they were like, they wanted to get it right. They're like, do you want the quote unquote regular single malt? Do you want the rare cask? Like, they want to make sure I got the exact right thing. So shout out to them. Because like, this is not a whiskey that you just find every day, you know? And also I just want to point out, I'm especially excited because I do review a good bit of Irish whiskey. I've covered and as a member of the media, a number of distilleries in person in Ireland. Most of the Irish whiskey that I do quote unquote work with, like review, it's actually Irish single pot still, which is a different type of whiskey than a single malt, right? Mm-hmm. Bushmills, they only make single malt, right? And so I don't get to review their products as much as I maybe would like. I don't get to review Irish single malt as much as I like. It's one of the styles of Irish whiskey, of which there are several. One that I don't get to cover as much. So super excited about it.
Yeah, and let it be known, as the purveyors of budget whiskeys that we are, we were not making you try the rare cask. We're just the bottom shelf 30-year Bushmills here. The entry.
I could have found rare cask. I just want to be clear here. I could have. Okay, if you're calling me out.
That's funny, man. All right, guys, let's dive in. Brad, let's hear your nosing notes. I think you drank it right before we pressed record tonight. I'm trying it live on air alongside David, so I'm gonna stick my nose in this glass now.
Yeah, this is a beautiful nose, Bob. For me, there's a really nice bit of almond throughout. It's got dried cherry. It has the PX kind of a sweet grape kind of nose. There's a bit of melon here, and it all has a nice little foundation of barley throughout. I think this is an incredible nose. 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm there with you, man. This has a really deep, rich decadence to it that we don't typically get on Irish whiskey. I mean, we've also done a lot of really young or blended Irish whiskeys as well. So this is obviously in a different category, but even among those, you don't usually get this much caramel, this much, what it reminded me of, Brad, honestly, was a couple years ago, we did the Amrut Fusion, which had this note of like stewed plum on it, like really heavy, like date, plum, prune.
Yes.
It's syrupy sweet. It's got maple on it. I mean, obviously, I think it's coming from those ex-bourbon casks it was sitting in, but there is just wave after wave of really dark, caramely, syrupy notes going on here. I'm going to give it a 9.5, Brad.
I think you all get great notes. Brad, you say almond, I get kind of an almond extract note here, particularly Bob, to your notes about, it's like dates, we get black raisins, I get Luxardo cherry. For me, the note that I often use for really good single malts with some good PX influence, like if they go a really good direction, I get a lot of figgy pudding, right? And figgy pudding is not something that like I have eaten, but I just want to be clear, I don't like make it every holiday, but it's just this like nexus of dark and fruity and decadent and rich, but also sweet and confectionery a little bit.
Yep.
And so I don't really have much to add. I'm just kind of yes-anding really what you all are saying here. And for me, that kind of coalesces as like, honestly, like flambéed figgy pudding, right? With like, you just lit it on fire and you get some of that like extra alcohol caramelization loveliness. Yeah, I really, really enjoy this. And Brad, to your point, I do get the underlying malt that's not lost from the wood influence, which is really, really lovely. For me, nose wise, I'm gonna say it's like high 8s for me. Probably a 9. See, I'm used to doing stuff also on a 100-point scale for like spirits competitions. The 10-point scale is very different. So I'm just gonna round up and say a 9 on this. It's really lovely. I have been lucky to have some of the rare cask expressions from Bushmills, and some of those I would rate the nose even a little bit more, but you really can't ask for much more than this on the nose. This is like really, really good stuff.
Yeah, that's for me. I think that, David, your expansive whiskey is going to lead to a slightly lower score than us. And I think that's probably a good thing, because I am quite effusive about this. I texted Bob earlier and was like, dude, I drank this Bushmills 30 and dear sweet Jesus.
One thing I want to say on the nose, listen, a lot of folks in Scotch like to poo-poo Irish single malt, and they shouldn't be poo-pooing Irish single malt because it can be really, really spectacular, and it can punch right up there with the best. And I have nosed some sherry, it finished in like really good, like legendary single estate port pipe scotches that are 40 plus years old and have really lovely like PX influence. And this is right up there with them. This 30-year-old Irish single malt is right up there with some of the really expensive, incredibly highly regarded, super rare, sherried 40-plus-year-old scotches I've reviewed or sampled in the past couple of years. So like, it's good stuff.
I'm going to go as fast as I can with my tasting notes here. Brad, this is only a 46% ABV whiskey, but it's a flavor bomb. And I will say, incredible prickliness on the tongue here. You could have convinced me this was much higher proof than it is. What I'll say about it is all the notes that we identified on the nose are here on the palate. You do get a slight bitterness from the malt, but what I love about this is that it doesn't turn into a burnt or ashy flavor at the back. It's not overly oaked. And the bitterness actually presented for me, I've been making these a lot lately. One of my favorite whiskey cocktails is called the Brown Derby, which is a bourbon and grapefruit juice cocktail. I get notes of grapefruit on the back of this. It's not overly bitter. It's not pithy, but it brings a note of kind of slightly sour, bitter citrus to the party that covers up for what might have otherwise tasted a little bit too charred. I'll give it a 9 on the taste, Brad.
Yeah, I think that this palate is like near perfection for me. Like the raisins really come through, the melon is there. I put grapefruit as like one of my key elements of this. And once again, the barley is there. And it has like for me, the almond almost moved into like a hazelnut, like praline almost kind of vibe. I'm at a 10 out of 10 on this flavor bomb. I think it is everything I want in a whiskey.
I prefer the palate to the nose. I loved the nose. I want to be very clear here. I think the palate's even better. Bob, I get that. You kind of predisposed me. For me, it's grapefruit candy specifically. not great. Like there's these specific small grapefruit candies that I used to love as a kid that this really reminds me of. I think the palate, I have a moment on the mid palate where I'm worried that this is going to go too dry and it's going to be a little too maybe ashy, get into too much like dry wine territory. But what it does instead, it blossoms with tropical fruit, led by grapefruit, but with also some papaya and guava. And you said prickly, but I also get prickly pear cactus fruit on this, or prickly pear on this, which is actually something that I do eat occasionally because it's like a bodega near me has it weirdly cheap, so I'll just like buy a bunch of them. So this is, I love when single malts, like when they blossom into tropical fruit, like kind of after the mid palate, and it really carries through for just this like bright, vibrant finish. And this really does. So, on the palate, on a 10-point scale, I'm like a 9.4 maybe on this, maybe 9.5. It's this whiskey like shows up and then holds its own through the entire phase of the sip.
Absolutely. Yeah, and continuing it through onto the finish, I think there's a creaminess that develops as well. Like the grapefruit is the predominant note that I'm left with, but again, it doesn't tip into like a really bitter grapefruit kind of pith flavor, and it's not overly sweet, but I think that's where the viscosity really like takes over, is on the finish for me. It's a really long, mouth-watering finish. I get a little bit, do you remember those candies we've referenced a couple times, Brad? Cream savers? They're like the lifesavers with the little swirls in them.
Oh, dude,
It's like that with a nice little hit of grapefruit juice on top of it. Once again, I'm going to be pretty high on this. I do think I'll come down just a hair to an 8.5 out of 10 here.
I think the finish reminds me of an Aldi's chocolate that my wife really likes. It's a dark chocolate with orange peel in it.
Oh yeah.
I was sitting here after I drank it and I was just kind of enjoying the finish and I was like, oh, it's that dark chocolate with orange. It's so good. There's still hazelnut in there for me. The grapefruit sticks around. The raisins stick around. For me, it finally fell into that like plum category on the finish. I'm still really high on this. I'm at a 9 out of 10 on the finish.
I'm coming down just a little for the finish, but I thought the finish was still very good. You also predisposed me. I like going last because I can just riff off of what you all say, and it makes me sound like a better taster than I am. Those chocolate oranges that you got around the holiday that you like hit on the table to open?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, if you made one with grapefruit instead of orange, that's what this is like on the finish.
Do you remember those Guinness commercials from back in the day with the cartoon characters that would just shout "Brilliant" at the end?
Yeah, like the toucan. Yeah.
That we need to pitch that to the Terry's Corporation over in England, and just they need to have a grapefruit one now. That sounds fantastic.
But it's just this. I do get a little grapefruit pith on this, and I don't mind that. I get a tiny bit of minty and menthol on this. It's some action. There's some fun action on the upper palate, actually, which surprised me a little bit. It's not the best finish I've had on an Irish single malt. I've had some Bushmills finishes that are actually a little more memorable for this. But again, when I'm coming back down to like a 9, this is still a better finish than the vast majority of whiskeys I'll ever taste. You know what
Absolutely.
I mean? And weirdly, the finish has some things in common. I tasted the Stranahan Snowflake release for this year recently. I had a call with their blender, Justin, great guy. And I'm only mentioning that because it's another Proximo company, and I'm going to stay in portfolio here. So everyone's going to be really happy with me on the brand side, right? I'm not going to mention anything out of portfolio, right? Stranahan's, Bushmills, both Proximo brands. Company, they're going to love it. Hopefully they'll like me for that. Justin is a great blender. I think some of the things I got on this year's Snowflake, as far as like the drier, pithier fruit on the finish, I'm getting a little bit of that here. Right. And so I've been drinking a lot of American single malt lately, and it's really cool to see some notes that I'm getting in really phenomenal multi-decade aged single malts from abroad. And I'm able to tie those to notes in really high end, super premium single malts from American single malt makers.
Yeah.
Right. For me, that's really cool. And something that 5 years ago would have been maybe next to impossible.
Yeah, when we get into the balance here, folks, if you're new to listening to our podcast, by the way we talk about balance, think of it as cohesiveness, and especially in the first three categories. So from the nose to the taste to the finish, was any one of those kind of wildly out of whack with the other three? And I don't think they were. I think this is actually a spectacularly well-balanced whiskey. I'm still getting notes that are coming up on the finish. Like when you go to like a hibachi restaurant and they give you the little slivers of ginger on the side of your meal. Mm-hmm. Like I'm getting ginger on this, which is something that I never get on Irish whiskey.
I just got cafe cream, like cafe creme or cafe cream.
Yeah.
Just a tiny bit of coffee, but with that milkiness that you were referencing, Bob. I also want to point, like, I have my notes, like my tasting notes, how I would rate a whiskey. There's also a crushability factor. Like, do you just want to drink the ever-loving crap out of this?
Yep.
Yes.
Crushability factor here is very high.
Off the charts.
Very, like, I literally was sitting here when I finished, just hold it. You know how, like, you hold a bottle to, like, get every last drop into your glass? Mm-hmm. I was holding the glass so that I could get every last drop into my mouth.
Absolutely, man. And I think that I was ready to kind of come into this part of the review and say, it's not the most nuanced or the most complex whiskey we've ever had, but especially when you're thinking about the Irish whiskeys that we reviewed on this podcast, Brad, I think it's at the top or near the top for Irish whiskey. And I think that the more I talk about it, the more notes I keep finding in it. So it's almost like, the little engine that could here. It's just funny because you would think that I wouldn't have to talk about it like it's punching above its weight. It's a 30-year-old single malt. I think the balance here is really, really great. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. Brad, what are you at?
Yeah, I'm at a 9.5 as well. I think that this is complex and rich, and yet every single note that we get is a river that runs well together. Like, there's no rapids, there's nothing throwing you off course. It's all working together so well.
How does this tasting experience approximate the sensation of riding a sandworm? That's really what we should be. That's the scale we should be.
That is a great question, Bob.
You picked a big one, like in Dune 2 when he has to ride the sandworm for the first time, and he picks a big one.
How would Shai Hulud think of this whiskey? That's what we really need to be asking. David, where are you at numerically on the balance here?
I'm just a little bit below you guys, and it's not because this isn't a stellar whiskey. It's because, like, I feel like I've been lucky to kind of see the mountaintop of what Bushmills can do, and I know they can produce some things that, as great as this is, stick with me with punch but elegance, like even slightly more. So for me, I'm probably a 9.4. I just want to point out, though, the crushability factor here is rare. Like, I've reviewed some whiskeys that are off the charts good, and I rate very highly. And I just like sit with a half ounce of them for like an hour.
Mm-hmm.
This is a whiskey where my glass is basically empty now. And I'm like, when do I get to pour some more? Right.
Yeah.
This is just whiskey I want to drink. So there's like this X factor there that my numerical rating is like underselling it a little bit, even though my numerical rating is extraordinarily high. This is a great whiskey, guys. This is a great whiskey.
Yeah. And with our final category here, David, we normally do our value category and we give a price, and we will give the price on this whiskey, but it is falling within our luxury category, which essentially for us is like, for a lot of people, once you hit $300-$400, the upwards range of the price might not start to matter as much as for somebody who's used to spending $30 and looking at a $70 or $80 bottle.
Yeah,
you know what
exactly.
I mean?
Yeah, there's really no cost is not an obstacle at this point if you're looking at buying this whiskey. And so what we've kind of done at this point when we're reviewing luxury whiskeys, and Brad, I'm finding this around $2,000 online, just as a baseline. I'll say $2,000. If you're already looking at spending $2,000 on a whiskey, we know that you can afford to spend $2,000 on a whiskey, and so we usually come in with a baseline of 5 out of 10, and can go up or down from there. I think I'm going to go up from 5 out of 10.
I was going to say, you usually come out with a 5 out of 10 baseline.
Speaking for the both of us, we're at a 5 out of 10. But I do think that among luxury categories here, we're not actually comparing this to like all the $2,000 whiskeys we've had. Which one's the best? Is this a product that can justify costing this much? Absolutely. Based on the market, based on the actual amount of liquid left in the barrels after 30 years, yes. I don't feel like they're price gouging. I don't feel like there's anything gimmicky happening here. I'm going to give this a 7.5 out of 10, Brad, just because I don't know that I can go really higher than that. If you're already thinking about spending $2,000 on this whiskey, you don't need my endorsement for it.
Oh, I will give my endorsement for it. I think this is a 9 out of 10 value, Bob.
Wow.
Like, I know it's $2,000, but if I were to ever spend $2,000 on a whiskey, I know what I would be spending it on.
Mm-hmm.
So, like for me, that just, once again, I have not drank nearly as many $2,000 plus whiskeys, nor has Bob, as have you, David. So, like, I am A-okay with knowing that my score is based on a smaller sample size. But for me, I think this is a great value.
What I will say is, in the grand scheme of like 30-year-old single malts, you'll see a lot that are more expensive than that. And I think this is frankly better than a lot of more expensive single malts. I'm going to probably say value. Value is something I actually am rarely asked to put that in reviews. So I feel much less qualified to talk about monetary value than you guys, because I'm actually often asked to just ignore that, even if I want to factor it in.
Right.
I'll probably say 8 on this, because I think this is a whiskey that you're not going to be, it's impossible to be disappointed with this whiskey, right? This is a truly, truly special whiskey. I think you can pay much more for whiskey that's not nearly as good, frankly.
Yep.
It's great stuff. One little plug I want to give. I'm not paid by Bushmills, by the way. I want to point out, like, I did not accept money from Bushmills. They sent me this. I have a contact at their PR agency of record. They sent me this. I'm very thankful for that. But like, I will, look at this like I do any other liquid. One thing I will say is, if you don't want to spend $2,000, but you want a really good, well-aged Bushmills, Irish single malt, if you are flying through different parts of Europe, go to duty free, because Bushmills has a number of duty free special bottles. Many of them I think are like 21 years. And they roll them out with some frequency, and they have like different expressions. I have yet to have a Bushmills duty free exclusive that I didn't really like.
Mm-hmm.
Some I like more than others. And I'm not saying that they're not like punching where this is, but they're really good. And they're like USD, it's like $160 or $200. Right?
Yeah.
And there's some really, really fun ones. And I'm not saying they're all this good, but if you want to have a really great Irish single malt experience and you want to try some really fantastic Bushmills that is different than like the 10-year you're going to be able to find at most liquor stores in the US. If you're flying through Europe or you're flying internationally, check out the duty free Bushmills 21-year duty free exclusives. I find are often worth it. They're often the bottle that in coming back from Europe especially, or Ireland especially, will often regret not getting more bottles of.
What I hear you saying is Bushmills has an incredibly well-rounded portfolio.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say well-rounded, because they produce single malt, right? You have a lot of Irish distillers that produce a lot of different styles of whiskey. Some are producing single malt and Irish single pot still and single grain. Like, they're doing a lot of different stuff. Bushmills is doing a lot with single malt, right?
Mm-hmm.
So take that as you will. But what they do well. And I want to point out too that like there are around 50 active distilleries in Ireland right now. At one point there were only 2.
Mm-hmm.
And it was within like our parents' lifetimes. And Bushmills was one of them, right? And for a long time, Bushmills, like a lot of the highly aged Irish single malt that you'll see these days released from other brands is actually sourced from Bushmills.
Yep.
And you see people putting their own spin on it, and some of this whiskey is very highly regarded and very well rewarded. And it starts with really great base distillate. And Bushmills, their base distillate's very good. They produce good single malt. They know what they're doing,
100%. Brad, I'm coming out to a 44 out of 50 on this one, and it's because my value score is a little bit lower. If I had given it the 10 out of 10, I'd be at 46.5 out of 50 on this. Where are you sitting on this one, Brad?
You called it, man. 46.5 out of 50.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
David, I did not do the honors of tallying up your score. We're going to be on the lookout for your print review of this sometime soon, with, proper attribution of film and whiskey, of course, and the check in the mail, obviously. So,
and That's royalties. This is a film podcast.
Bob, I was
That's
going to say that it would be a check from us to him, to be clear.
Exactly. We're coming out to an average of a 45.25 out of 50 or a 90.5 out of 100. This has hit the 90 mark, Brad. That is rarefied air here on Film and Whiskey. We've done 500 plus reviews now, and I think we've only had maybe 5 or 6 ever hit the 90 mark.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm pretty I know for a fact it's less than 10.
Yeah. Yep.
At the end of the day, like, if you get the chance to try Bushmills 30-year Irish single malt, do it. Like,
yes.
Like, I can't imagine a seasoned whiskey drinker or even a novice whiskey drinker who's not going to be able to appreciate this whiskey, right?
100%.
I think that's what blew me away, is that this is the most perfect combination of like complex and approachable.
100%.
And
dude.
I think the best way to describe it is crushability. David, we might steal that word, and we'll attribute you.
I stole it from my friend Mark. Right? Like I have no original thoughts. I just riff off you guys and my friends. But it's so crushable. It's so crushable. Not that we would ever endorse drinking to excess.
No,
sure.
But crushing, yeah.
You know what else is crushable, Brad?
What's that, Robert?
All those guys that get crushed by a sandworm at the end of Dune Part 2.
Dude, what? Let's get into it. I have thoughts.
All right, man.
All right, everybody. That was Bushmills 30-year single malt, one of the best whiskeys we have ever drank on this podcast. And it is easily paired with the greatest sandworms that we have ever seen in a film.
Well, now I'm rethinking that transition. So, Brad, let's get into our game for the day, which we call 2 Facts and a Falsehood.
Brad is gonna try to stump you, Bob. 2 are right and 1 is wrong. 2 facts and a falsehood.
2 Facts and a Falsehood is the part of the show where Brad presents me with 3 items as fact about the making of this movie, one of which is a complete lie. Brad, I'm doing pretty well on the season. Am I at, what am I at now?
I think like 8-3.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Something around there.
Now, we do have a guest today, and what that means is that if I enlist David's help and we get the question right, I get 1 victory. But if we get it wrong, I get 2 losses. So we often end up at the end of the season with more than 32 points for our 32 weeks. It gets very confusing, but it's a system that is meant to penalize me.
Yes.
So, David, I can tell you immediately, I'm going to enlist your help because otherwise it makes for very bad audio if I just ignore the guest for 5 minutes. You also know more about Dune than I do, so I feel like you are going to be a fountain of knowledge here. Brad, why don't you hit me with your 2 facts and a falsehood?
Fact number 1, to capture the ferocity of Arrakis' sandstorms, the crew built a wind tunnel that could generate speeds over 150 miles per hour and mixed in with it real desert sand. Several cast members referred to these shoots as the most intense exfoliation of their lives. Fact number 2, director Denis Villeneuve and cinematographer Greg Fraser carefully scouted desert locations and selected sites based on the precise curve of the sand or the ideal alignment of sunlight. Maintaining the untouched look of the landscapes required a military level of discipline from the crew members, who were instructed to move in tight, single-file corridors to avoid disrupting the sand. Fact number 3, director Denis Villeneuve envisioned Fade Rotha Harkonnen, played by Austin Butler, as a blend of psychopathic killer, Olympic-level swordmaster, Snake, and Mick Jagger. Interestingly, Jagger himself was once slated to portray the character in Alejandro Jodorowsky's ambitious but unrealized Dune adaptation of the 1970s.
Ooh.
All right, let me tell you what I'm immediately targeting here, David. So fact number 3, what Brad will often do is he'll give 90% of a fact and then add like a little phrase at the end to throw me off.
That is not true, Bob. I do not often do that. I rarely do that.
And it pisses me off every time. And
it pisses you off so much that you think I often do it.
It sticks in my brain, man. I know that I think it's pronounced Jodorowsky's Dune was unrealized. I have no idea if Mick Jagger was ever considered for that project. There's a documentary about the making of that unmade movie. So I have not seen it. I have no idea about the Mick Jagger of it all. Apart from that, fact number one sounds pretty made up to me. 150 mile an hour winds that they were dumping sand into. Because, David, we've both worked. One of us, you. What am I saying? You have worked with real actors. I have never worked with real actors. I have heard stories about people who work with actors.
Did you almost claim that you've worked with actors?
Man, I was out on a limb there, dude.
You sure were.
I had to pull that one back quickly. I don't even know why I thought that was what should come out of my mouth. I haven't been nowhere near actors in my life, Brad. All that to say, I can't imagine much of a world where agents and stars are getting themselves into a wind tunnel where they're having sand blown at their corneas and talking about the exfoliation fat. Like, unless they had goggles on, which they do in some parts of the movie, but that just seems like something that probably didn't happen to me.
It also doesn't mean that Zendaya was in the thing.
Well, yeah, that just means they dragged her double in there and forced that poor girl to endure life-altering cornea damage.
And we know that doubles are treated so well.
Wait, Brad, just to clarify, the first fact is 150 miles an hour?
Yes.
That's hurricane force, man.
That's more than hurricane. That's like, I think hurricane force tops, like, that's more than, that's.
Are we, do you think that's the falsehood?
So the thing about number 3 is, I think number 2 is almost certainly correct, right? Because I think it just needs, like, I think that there had to have been discipline regarding, like, not disturbing, because, like, that makes sense, right? Yeah. I think that, like, was how the film was filmed. 3, I kind of remember that. I think I might be conflating. It's a little confusing because in David Lynch's version, Fade Rotha is played by Sting.
Mm-hmm.
Who, by the way, does a really good job. Like, I really liked that performance. I thought it was really, of all the weird stuff in that movie, I was like, oh, this actually was pretty well done.
This kind of works. Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of works. So I feel like I'd heard that about Mick Jagger, but, like, I can't quite remember. At the same time, the 150 mile an hour, like, I don't think humans survive 150 mile an hour winds, right? Like 100 mile an hour winds are like, you like die in though, like you're just dead. You know what I mean? Like, I think number 1 would have worked if it had been like 75 miles an hour. I would have been like, oh yeah.
Yeah. 150 does sound instantly fatal.
I think that's just lethal. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so, and I think we would have heard about that. Like, entire cast of Dune killed because of really bad decision.
And then they make a horror film based on that wind tunnel.
We've essentially created a sandblaster at that point.
Like, I think sandblasters don't hit that velocity.
Okay, are we in agreement that we're going to go with number 1 then?
I think number 1. Here's the problem though. I get all of the ups. I get to share in the upside of a win, but I have none of the repercussions of getting it wrong. But I will say number 1 is what I would suggest.
I was leaning towards 1 anyway. So David, no fault falls on you. I'm going to go with number 1, Brad, and I'm going to lock it in as my final answer here.
I feel like you guys have beaten this one to death, as a 150 mile an hour wind tunnel would also do. That is correct. It is the falsehood.
At any point in writing that falsehood, did you think to yourself, 150 sounds like a bit much. Maybe I should tone that down.
You know, I've never lived in Florida. I've never paid a ton of attention to hurricanes. So no, I didn't really think about it.
Yeah. I want you to, next time the weather report says in your area you have 30 mile an hour gusts, step outside.
Just go outside, check it out.
Step outside, face the wind, and go, okay, 5 times this speed.
150, baby.
Would I have a face if this hit 150?
Yeah, like 5 times the speed and sand. You know what I mean? Like,
it'd be like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The face is just melting off.
Oh my gosh. All right, guys, David did have to jump off of our call. So Brad and I are going to finish out most of the episode here. We'll bring David back in for final scores. Brad, I want to jump back in where we left off, talking about this supporting cast. And it's such a big cast that I think maybe let's just pick one or two people that blew our minds. Starting with someone who is very quickly becoming our person on this podcast, Rebecca Ferguson.
Dude, she's so good.
I may have a crush on Rebecca Ferguson. In fact, I think I probably do. Like, she's really, really beautiful and also an incredible actress.
I absolutely have a crush on my wife, and that is the only person I have a crush on.
I mean,
Bob.
it's not that, not that kind of crush. It's just like
Rebecca Ferguson is incredible in this movie. She has this brooding intensity within her that just screams when it's on screen. I mean, what an actress, what a performance.
I think one of the overarching things that we've already talked about in this episode is like, this second film in the franchise, to me, is leaps and bounds better than the first movie. And
so much better.
I liked the first movie quite a bit. That's like an 8 out of 10 for me. It does everything better, including being a little more Hollywood, right? Like, there's a lot more punchlines. There's actual jokes and laughs. And a lot of them come from Javier Bardem, and some of them come from Josh Brolin. But even Rebecca Ferguson, for as eerie and creepy and dark and sometimes evil as she is, they play that for laughs a couple times. Like the way she cuts people off and uses the voice, or the way that she's just like walking around the halls talking to her unborn baby. It's kind of funny sometimes. And I think that Villeneuve recognizes that, to his credit.
Yeah. And he implements her for the absolute most impact that she could have had in this movie.
100%. So we started talking about Javier Bardem. I personally believe this man should be nominated for an Academy Award for this movie. It is exactly what a supporting performance is supposed to be.
Yes.
He's so funny.
Yep.
He's so over the top at parts, but he also has a believability and a real emotional depth. There's a moment where he's been wounded in battle and he's talking to Paul about, hey, you should just kill me and then go talk at the council. And he's
because killing him would make him the leader.
Right. And he's like, man, I don't believe in any of that prophecy stuff. And he's like, I don't care if you don't believe in it. I believe in it. And it's one of the to see this character who's been portrayed at times as kind of like the fanatic who is also a buffoon, be able to impart on the audience, I'm not a buffoon. I really believe this. And it's okay if you don't believe it because I have faith in you. It's just it's a more nuanced performance than I think it's gotten credit for.
I think it's the best performance in the movie, Bob. I think he does such a stellar job of everything that you said. Like, he plays things for laughs. He knows that he's a mentor figure in Paul's life, and he takes that so seriously. And the belief with which he looks towards Paul, like once again, like I said earlier about Zendaya, like his eyes communicate so much about who this character is. I was hoping we would get to him soon because I do think he is my favorite performance of this movie.
I feel like we're kind of giving short shrift to the rest of the cast, but they're all like uniformly very, very good.
They're so good, dude.
Yeah,
Austin Butler.
He
has black teeth.
Not doing the Elvis voice. Yeah. It's pretty great. Okay, Brad, I do want to talk a little bit about the end of the film, which I do think we have different reads on. And in order to do that, I want to get to my let's make it a double. I won't do the little spiel here. We'll do that when it's time for yours. But I'm going to pair this movie up with The Godfather Part 2. Now, we have not done Godfather 2 on this podcast, so I'm
I've
kind
never
of
seen
tipping.
it, so don't spoil it.
Yeah, So the arc of the main character, Michael Corleone, across the first two Godfather movies, it's intended to be taken as one arc. And you see from the young upstart in the first movie who doesn't want anything to do with the family business to then becoming the Godfather at the end of the first movie, you see the moral decay of Michael across the second film. And it's a much darker movie than the first one is. It's much more sad. It really does play on the level of tragedy because it's intercut with the story of Marlon Brando's character when he was young and first coming to America. And so you watch the juxtaposition, Brad, of Michael alienating his family and kind of ruining the legacy of his own family, interspersed with Brando doing everything for his family and like making them rise to power. And I think that this movie is really similar in how it does that arc with Paul Atreides. Because by the end of the film, what you've seen is a really complex portrayal where you can take multiple readings of it. Is he a conniver? Has he just done all of this to further advance himself and or ensure his survival, which has been what he's been saying the whole time? But then you also see moments throughout the film where he's legitimately concerned for the well-being of the Fremen in not going south because he knows it's going to cause death. And then it just kind of gets to a point where it seems like it's inevitable. It is his fate to go south, to become the Lisan al-Gaib and truly lean into what is his destiny and fate, knowing that it will kill millions or perhaps trillions of people. And I think that it's a portrayal of a heroic character that we haven't seen since movies in the 70s, like The Godfather, where your protagonist, you know, I don't want to compare it to like Breaking Bad, because I don't think he becomes the actual villain of the story, but you could feel the energy in the theater of like, oh God, like Paul is starting the jihad at the end of this movie. Like this is not where I thought this was going to go. He is declaring war on the entire galaxy. What the hell is going on here? Is this good? Is this bad? These people certainly seem to appreciate it, but we know that it's going to cause death and destruction. And so I'm really interested to hear your read on the end of the film. Do you see it as uplifting from the point of view of the Fremen, or do you see it as a big blinking red warning sign for the character of Paul?
I think I saw it as like inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't think at any point in the film I ever doubted that he was going to go south and become the Lisan al-Gaib.
Right.
Like that felt like I said, inevitable to me. I don't think I see it in terms of good and evil per se. Like for me, it feels like Paul as a character isn't actually concerned about survival. That never seemed to be his own survival. That never seems to be his thing. Like, oh, I have to survive. Like his whole motivation for the first half of the film is revenge for his father. And as he learns the ways of the Fremen and falls in love with Chani and with the Fremen culture as a whole, like he then wants to become the savior of the Fremen. And so it feels like a transformation of his motivation. And the only way to truly free the Fremen is to take on the entire galaxy because of the value that spice has. That the only way to bring freedom to the planet is to control the entire galaxy. And so I guess I don't really see it in the same way that you do.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm surprised that, well, I don't want to say that you're taking a surface level reading of it, because I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm surprised that you're reading it on its face so much, though, because I think that the movie really is interrogating the questions of like, is this inevitable or was this manufactured? Did they pull so many strings to make him become the Lisan al-Gaib? Even if he does have these powers as a result of drinking worm piss, like, is he really fulfilling a prophecy, or is this sort of a, Macbeth self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing? And I do think that there is a lot of kind of Shakespearean ambition and perhaps folly in the Paul Atreides character. And so you're right. I do think that it's inevitable. Like at no point do you think, oh, I wonder if he's actually going to go south. But it is inviting you as the viewer to question, like, even if this is his destiny, are we supposed to root for it? Or are we just kind of helpless bystanders watching the collapse of the universe here?
Yeah, I mean, the way the film portrays it, though, is that the Fremen have a better culture than the spacefaring races that have enslaved them.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it seems like more of a battle of like Paul learning to understand and love that culture and then fighting on its behalf. Like, yeah. I don't know if that's a surface level reading or not. Maybe it is.
No, and again, I'm not trying to insult. Like, I'm not saying you're taking I'm just saying, like, I just want you to know that I'm not. I didn't mean it in a negative way.
No, I know, dude. I think that I like the big stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't. I like the grand operatic narrative of a hero rising to the occasion, rising from the ashes like a phoenix to save a people group, to make the galaxy a better place. Now, once again, David probably knew the IP a million times better than us, and maybe the entire thing ends with the galaxy falling into ashes and every single human is killed. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
I just think that if you take Dune 2 on its own merits, I think the story ends in a place where belief in the prophecy triumphs over cold, calculating, manipulative, scientific, just desperate bid for survival.
Sure. So what I'm hearing from Brad is it's okay to colonize as long as you're really sure that your culture is the better culture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Okay, cool. All right, man. On that note, let's get into Let's Make It a Double for Brad, presented by Blackwood Distilling Company.
We're near the end of the episode, so thanks for listening to the Film and Whiskey Show. Let's pair another film with this one, even if it's a struggle. It's our final segment of the day, now let's make it a double.
Let's Make It a Double is the part of the show where we pick a movie to pair up with this one to make the perfect double feature. I've already picked Godfather Part 2. Brad, I'm really interested to hear what you'd like to pair this one up with.
Man, I feel like you could go a ton of different directions. I normally don't like to pair it with a movie we mentioned, but we barely mentioned it. I'm going to pair this with The Matrix.
Oh, interesting.
I think that I wanted to stay in the sci-fi vein for Let's Make It a Double, and I think that The Matrix is one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made, and B, I think that you have those similar ideas of struggles with being the one. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Paul is the one of Dune, Neo is the one of Matrix, and you have really interesting lead characters who struggle to come to terms with their identities and their new powers and what that will mean for the world around them. And I think that it would be a heck of a night. It'd be a very long night, but it would be a heck of a night to watch those two movies.
All right, so I've paired it up with Godfather 2. Brad has paired it up with The Matrix. Whatever you choose to pair this movie up with, you can always make it a double with Blackwood Distilling Company. And if you go to bourbonoutfitter.com/filmwhiskey, once again, that's bourbonoutfitter.com/filmwhiskey, and use our code FILMWHISKEY at checkout, you'll get 5% off your bottle of Blackwood as well. Brad, I think it is time for us to get into final scores on this movie, so let's bring back David for this. David, I'm going to throw to you first. Where are you landing on Dune Part 2? We're on a 1 to 10 scale. Half points are allowed.
Yeah. Thank you. 8.5 for me. Really, really enjoyed it. Not perfect, but think it should certainly be in award contention. And I hope that it can overcome the handicap that I think a lot of hard sci-fi faces when it comes to being taken seriously during movie award season.
Yeah, 100%.
And the question we've been asking all season, would you consider this a modern classic?
Yeah, I would. I would for this. I think it's a classic for two reasons. One, I think it's a great achievement in film, or at least a very, very good achievement in film. And I think it is a really fantastic, it's the interpretation of storied, legendary IP that we've been waiting for.
All right, Brad, what are you thinking about this one?
Bob, I think that the only way this would have been a perfect movie is if when Paul confronts the Emperor near the end of the film, when they're like in his ship area before they take him prisoner, if he had said something about his father and how he killed his father.
Yep.
And then Christopher Walken pulls a watch out and goes,
I wore this uncomfortable hunk of metal up my ass for 2 years.
and gave the speech. I think that would have made this a perfect movie.
Oh, man.
Really quickly, how did you feel about Christopher Walken being in this film?
I thought he was great. It was a way toned down Christopher Walken, but they do a great job of capturing his weirdness as Emperor. There's a couple of guys you could have done this with, like you could have gotten a Willem Dafoe if you wanted to. But I think Walken's a great choice, and he plays a guy with the burden of being Emperor very well.
I agree with that. Yeah, there's one specific line that he delivers right before the fight between Paul and Feyd-Rautha that I was like, oh, that was a bad line delivery. Like that was the one you chose, Denis? Other than that, I think he was spectacular. I'm actually in the same place as David on this. I'm at an 8.5. I think it is stunning and spectacular, and I will watch this movie again. You know, we didn't really talk about it much. The mixture of the cinematography and the sound design of this movie is a 10 out of 10.
Yep.
I mean, far and away, one of the most beautiful and moving movies I have ever seen in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The problems with the movie come with some of the dialogue. And then at the end of the film, Bob, I'm not going to lie, I think that there was way too much stuff at the start. I really wish there was more battle. You see the sandworms come in, it's freaking awesome, and then you don't see anything.
Yeah.
Anything of the main battle. And that, I'm here for the spectacle. I'm here for the Battle of Helm's Deep.
I was just going to say,
Pelennor Fields.
Well, and you're expecting a Helm's Deep. Like, it's set up where you understand where they have all these guys surrounded from. And when the sandworm comes in from that cloud of dust, it is the coolest shot in a movie I've seen this year. But you're right. They give you about 30 seconds of the fight and then they cut away. And in that way, it's much more akin to Pelennor Fields than it is to Helm's Deep, because it just feels like the fight's over immediately.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Pelennor Fields, great battle scene, but they had another Battle of the Black Gate battle scene to get to and a ton of other stuff. In this movie, it's like, this is what we've been building towards. And the exact same problem happens in the fight with him and Feyd-Rautha. Like, for one of the best choreographed and sound designed fights I've seen in a long time, you can't have Paul kill Feyd-Rautha off screen. I want to see him stab that blade into
I don't
him.
understand how he executed that maneuver, and I don't understand how he got gutted like a fish and then was just like, all right,
totally fine.
Let's game plan some more here.
And then he guts Feyd-Rautha in the exact same way that he just got stabbed, and yet Feyd-Rautha dies.
Immediately lethal. Yeah.
And so it's like a few things like that I'm like, ugh. Like, this is an 8.5 that was like a few things away from being like a 10 out of 10.
I think that this movie is almost hitting the ceiling it can hit. And I'm also at an 8.5, Brad, which is, I don't think we've ever been in lockstep like this with our guests.
Yeah.
But I remember sending you like screenshots of my ratings of this movie earlier in the year. And you kind of made fun of me after the second or third time I went to see this in the theater. And you're like, it seems pretty solidly like it's an 8.5 for you, dude. And I can't quite put my finger on it. I think it's that I'm more impressed by this movie than I am in love with this movie.
Agreed.
It's an incredibly impressive feat of movie making. I think part of the reason it hasn't gained the Oscars traction this year is that everyone is impressed by it on a craftsmanship level. But I don't know if it really has captured many people's hearts. And that's what's keeping this from being a Lord of the Rings for me. So I'm at an 8.5. You're at an 8.5. IMDb. 8.5 out of 10, Brad.
Oh my goodness.
There you go.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's hard for sci-fi to capture your heart because kind of the whole purpose of sci-fi is to stay away from the heart. And so it's like, this is the ceiling, I think, for a grand operatic sci-fi movie.
We do want to say thank you once again to our friend David Thomas Tao. We're sorry that he had to drop off before the end of the episode, but as you know, we be talking on this podcast, right?
Don't you know it? I would say this is one of our longer episodes, Bob.
It sure. Well, we had like a 30-minute whiskey review too, because that whiskey was
true.
Really damn good. So, folks,
it was really daggone good, and David is a premier whiskey taster and judge.
Next week, we will be back with Mad Max Fury Road, a movie that Brad has not seen, that exists on Earth, but I think is a great follow-up to Dune because it is kind of like soft sci-fi, Brad.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm super excited for it. It's one of those films that slipped out of my grasp once it was out of theaters, and I just never got around to it. And then we started the podcast, and I was like, well, we'll watch it eventually. So here I am, a week away from reviewing Mad Max Fury Road.
We'll be back next week with that one. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.